As we continue going south on Military Street, we come to this corner here, which is the corner of Military and Beard, and we're looking at the southwest corner here. And at one time, this corner looked just like this, with his home on it. This is the home of James Beard. The Beard family was heavily involved in lumber. Both the father and James' brother John were also in the lumber industry. They immigrated from New York, and shortly after they got here, James' father opened the Beard Mill, which was in Clyde Township. In 1839, James, along with his brother John, commenced lumbering on their own account under the firm name of J&J Beard Lumber Company. When they first commenced business, the capital of the firm of J&J Beard consisted of a yoke of oxen, an old sled, a tea kettle, a frying pan, and an iron pot. They had no money and did not own an acre of land. Their first venture was a contract to get the logs out of Canada. In 1841, this energetic young business firm bought their father's half interest in the mill and lands adjoining for $10,000 on 20 years' time. Their operations rapidly extended thereafter, and they bought thousands of acres of land in the townships of Clyde, Grant, Firstville, and Greenwood. Their father died at Port Huron in 1851 and was buried in the city cemetery. In 1856, the firm of J&J Beard was dissolved, John taking the Clyde Mill and lands, and James taking the Port Huron Mill and lands in other sections of the state. All right, let's get back to the corner of Military and Beard Street and look at this home again. I think the lumbermen always made the best homes. The third floor of this home had a ballroom. And of course the cellar was actually a wine cellar. And so I imagine they did a lot of entertaining. Would you like to take a wild guess where the name Beard Street came from? Well, I guess I'll just have to keep you in suspense. Not only did they own that corner, but the Beards owned a large plot of property. As you look into this old map here, you can see the Beards owned all the way from Military Street back, several blocks going west. And not only there, but they also owned the property just to the south of them, just behind the Vanderburg Platte. So they had quite a bit of property there. Mr. Beard was also one of the founders of the Northwestern Railway. Of course, his interest was mainly lumber, along with Henry Howard, who was also a lumberman. They wanted to have access to their lumber that was north of Port Huron. But the other investors, they were interested in the agricultural possibilities that a railway would bring to Port Huron. So in May of 1879, a 27-mile line from Port Huron to Croswell was completed. This line was gradually extended north to the tip of the thumb, reaching Port Austin in December of 1882. By the way, the station that we've been looking at is the Northwestern Railway Station that was at the foot of Court Street, and we'll look at this in more detail when we get to that location. This was a narrow gauge railroad, which means that the track was narrower than the normal railroad track would be. And of course, this meant that they needed less space, they could erect lighter bridges, you could buy narrow gauge railroad equipment more cheaply than normal sized trains, and grades could be steeper and curves tighter on narrow gauge lines compared to standard gauge railways. But narrow gauge lines also had to carry lighter loads than standard gauge railways. Presumably, the Port Huron and Northwestern foresaw their business as getting freight to and from Port Huron rather than shipping it on to eastern and western points using the standard gauge Grand Trunk line. Freight transferred from Port Huron and Northwest to the Grand Trunk had to be shifted from one rail car to another because of the difference in track size. This is what was said in 1915 about the railway. Port Huron has every reason to be proud of the Port Huron and Northwestern Railway. It has been built entirely without outside aid by citizens of Port Huron and is an acknowledged success. No other city in Michigan, we believe, has done as much, not even the metropolis, which I think is referring to Detroit. The road has already added much to the business and prosperity of Port Huron, as it has to the entire section of country through which it runs. 70 boxcars have been built here, and it is probable that the establishment of extensive car works will be one of the results of the building of the road. Although James Beard was one of the investors and founders of this railway, the motivating force behind the railway was Daniel Brown Harrington. He was a Port Huron capitalist and financier, but he was also of the Harrington Hotel fame. In July of 1878, only a few months before the beginning of construction, Mr. Harrington died, and when the first locomotive of the narrow gauge line arrived in Port Huron on December 28, 1878, his cab bore the name D.B. Harrington. The D.B. Harrington continued doing light work on the Port Huron Northwestern Railroad until 1888, when she was sold to Harvey and McCracken of Lake City, Michigan. 3 years later, she was acquired by Lewis Sands lumber operation in Manistee. After leaving the Port Huron Northwestern Railroad, D.B. Harrington had her name still, but as she moved from one logging company to another, her name was forgotten and replaced by a simple running number, which you see in this photograph here, number 1. This little engine continued pulling log trains until 1923, when the great Michigan forests were gone and the lumber industry was failing. The little engine was then transferred to another company, the Glen Haven Canning Company, which processed the cherries for which the area was famous. At the cannery, the locomotive was used as a stationary boiler. It was left outside, and the steam was piped into the plant. When in 1933 the plant too failed, the owner loaned the tiny locomotive to Traverse City, Michigan, as a display for Clinch Park. The city renovated the little logger at a cost of $1,500, but the owner retained legal title. And because he still owned it, a bid was made by Cedar Point for the engine, and he sold it to Cedar Point for $6,000. And it was perhaps fitting that the former D.B. Harrington find her new home at Sandusky, for her original namesake had lived in Sandusky in 1818 at the age of 11. He had played upon the walls of Fort Stephenson there, and when he left Sandusky for Michigan, his boat passed along the bay shore of Cedar Point, where the locomotive might one day recreate the days of the 19th century pioneer era. Upon her arrival at Cedar Point, it was seen to be in such deteriorated condition that the job of restoration would be extremely costly. Therefore, she was given a spot in the rear of the engine house and stored there for 4 years. In the spring of 1968, Mr. Foster gave the ancient engine a boiler test. She failed, and her boiler was therefore condemned. In this photograph here, the engine looks almost like a toy engine compared to the big mammoth engines that certainly came later. But at one time, this little engine was a workhorse not only for Port Huron Northwestern Railroad, but also for the lumber industry in Michigan. And you'll never guess where this little engine is today. It's in Port Huron. Somehow after Cedar Point, it made its way to the Henry Ford Museum, and then later Henry Ford Museum donated it to the Port Huron Museum. Currently, the Port Huron Museum has it in storage, and an inventory is being compiled to see what's needed for the Daniel B. Harrington. Initial plans are to keep it at the museum until a suitable display can be designed down at Vantage Point. The Community Foundation has partnered up with the museum to help this project move along, and we certainly wish them all the luck in the world. It would be wonderful to have this little engine come back to the point where it all started from. All right, let's get back to Mr. Beard. Mr. Beard may have also had an interest in the ferry company, as one of the ferries was named after him. You can see right here, James Beard. In the background, you can see the railroad bridge at the Port Huron Northwestern Railway crossed over to get to the upper parts of Michigan. This would have been the first railroad bridge that went across the mouth of Black River. This would have been a swing bridge. And after they were incorporated into the Pierre Marquette Railway, that's when the Basquiat Bridge was built that we know and see today, at least in 2015. James Beard died at his residence in Port Huron April 30th, 1882. He had been suffering for 2 years from some internal disease. I think it's safe to say that he lived a pretty interesting life. Join me next time as we mosey a little further down Military, and we'll look at the McMorran Mansion, and we'll look at one of the most prominent men of Port Huron, Henry McMorran.